One of the things that I think makes mountain railroading so attractive to model is the massive engineering works necessary to get the rails across the mountains. This is certainly true of the Canadian Pacific Railway's tortuous route they pushed across southern British Columbia, including the various mountain ranges that make up the Rocky Mountains. Their southern main line was made up of the Kettle Valley divisions to the west, connecting to the Kootenay divisions to the east, and it was one of those Kootenay divisions, the Boundary Subdivision, which formed the basis for the Columbia and Western Model Railroad. The headquarters for all the Kootenay divisions is the town of Nelson, situated on Kootenay Lake, and the Boundary Subdivision itself gets its name from the Boundary District, which is nestled on the international boundary with Washington State, about 50 miles to the west of Nelson. While designing the layout, I wanted to make sure that it featured the engineering necessary to get the rails over the mountains. And while it was easy to sketch bridges in 2 dimensions on a track plan, I'd never built a bridge before, so I was very uncertain how I was going to build all those big bridges. Well, luckily for me, it turns out that I love building bridges, and now the last of the big ones is done, I'd like to show you how they turned out. And before starting the video, I'd like to thank everyone for putting up with those paper bridge mock-ups for so many years. Although I took grief for them, that grief certainly motivated me to get the final bridges in place. This series of maps is taken from Roger Burrows' excellent book, Railway Mileposts Volume 2, Railways of Southern British Columbia. The seeds of the Boundary Subdivision were sown in 1890 with the chartering of the Columbia and Western Railway. The intention of the Columbia and Western was to allow for ores from the Nelson region to be taken west to Castlegar, where they could be transloaded onto lake boats for the trip up the Arrow Lakes to Revelstoke on the Canadian Pacific Main Line to the north. The first direct rail connection to Nelson from the outside world was actually the GN affiliate, the Nelson and Fort Shepherd, which reached Nelson from the south in 1895. Very shortly after that, the Canadian Pacific established their own direct rail connection by driving rails along the southern side of Kootenay Lake from the east. Then, as part of their plan to cut the Great Northern off from the mineral resources of the southern British Columbia region, the Canadian Pacific consolidated the Columbia and Western into the Boundary Subdivision. In its most significant configuration, the Boundary Subdivision stretched west all the way from Nelson, 126.6 miles, to Midway in southern British Columbia. It was here at Midway that the Kettle Valley divisions began to take the trains the final distance over the mountains to connect with the main line at Hope and then the run along the Fraser River to Vancouver. While the Boundary Subdivision had to cross not one but 2 mountain passes, the focus of this video are on the many bridges that it needed to cross the waterways. Of the 10 major bridges on the prototype Boundary and Slocan subdivisions, I was able to find room for 8 of them. The first bridge westbound out of Nelson on the Boundary Subdivision is the crossing of the Kootenay River at Tagum. This is actually the 4th and final crossing of the Kootenay River the Canadian Pacific Southern Main Line makes. Located at milepost 4 of the sub, the Kootenay River Bridge crosses at a location where 2 islands split the Kootenay into 3 separate channels. It uses a combination of 7 half-deck plate girder bridges, 1 full-deck plate girder bridge, and 1 157-foot-long through-truss bridge over the deepest part of the channels. While the model is compressed only about 30% from the prototype in length, it features only 1 intermediate island as opposed to the prototype's 2, and 4 half-plate deck girder bridges as opposed to the prototype's 7. It does, however, have a 150-foot-long through-girder bridge, this one made by BLMA, which is pretty close to the prototype's 157-foot-long version. Traveling another 7.5 miles west along the Kootenay River brings us to South Slocan and the junction with the Slocan Subdivision. At milepost 26.4 of the Slocan Sub, we find the interesting 110-foot-long through-pony truss bridge across rocky Lemon Creek. This bridge still exists today and is used as part of the Rails to Trails network in southern BC. This bridge was my first real scratch building effort, and it was designed and built using microengineering lattice girders and lattice plastistruct parts. Back at the Boundary Subdivision, and heading 3 miles further west along the Kootenay River, we arrive at the 332-foot-long bridge over the Slocan River. The Slocan River Bridge comprises a 157-foot-long deck truss bridge, with the rails slightly depressed relative to the deck around it, sandwiched between two 85-foot-long deck plate girder bridges. The model is compressed 30% from the prototype both in height and length, and is built around a frame soldered from telescopic brass tubing. The trusses are constructed out of Central Valley and Plastruct lace girders, while the deck girders on the ends are from microengineering. The cut stone pier was made from 2 Chooch resin castings, while the concrete pier was carved from balsa wood, which was then covered with epoxy wood filler. Traveling another 11 miles down the Boundary Subdivision, we reach where the Kootenay River ends as it outflows into the Columbia River. The CP uses a 703-foot-long combination of bridges to bridge the Columbia at this point, which in fact is the 4th place in British Columbia that the CP crosses the Columbia River. Of special note, the last span in the bridge is a swing girder bridge originally located on Falls Creek in Vancouver. It was moved to the Kootenays and placed here with the intention that it would allow boats to travel through the bridge on the Columbia River. However, there is no indication that this swing bridge was ever opened, and it is now welded shut. Unfortunately, given the prototype's length and my lack of space, the Columbia River Bridge is one of 2 of the Boundary Sub prototype bridges that I was forced to leave out of the Columbia and Western's design. To the west of Castlegar, the Boundary Subdivision passes first the Celgar Pulp Mill and then the Pope and Toppet Lumber Mill, and then it begins the 2.2% ascent to Farron Summit. The rails hug the southern shoreline of the lower Arrow Lake and steadily climb the hills until at milepost 36.1 they cross McCormick Creek. The McCormick Creek Bridge is a steel trestle 190 feet high and 410 feet long. The 3 center spans are deck truss bridges and there are 2 deck plate girder bridges on each end. Similar to the model of the Slocan River Bridge, the McCormick Creek Bridge is modeled at 70% of full size. To fit McCormick Creek Bridge into the space I had available, I had to put it on an 18-inch curve, which significantly increased the modeling challenge. To try and ensure everything fit after the model was finished, I built it around a soldered frame of telescopic square brass tubing. The 3 truss bridges are fabricated around the brass frame using Central Valley lace girders and Plastruct components. The 2 girder bridges on each end are made from microengineering parts. The piers are again from Chooch, and the abutments are made from balsa wood covered in epoxy wood filler. The McCormick Creek trestle is set well back in an alcove of the Columbian Western, and I hope this is what it would look like should you be walking up McCormick Creek and suddenly discover the trestle soaring above you. Here's the view along the rails heading out from shield siding across McCormick Creek Trestle. Again, because of space limitations, I was forced to put McCormick Creek Bridge on the opposite side of shields from where it exists in the real life. Further west at milepost 41.1 of the boundary subdivision, the rails cross Far Creek, also known as Fire Creek. It's here that a very unique bridge with a unique history resides. The prototype bridge is a 335-foot-long pin-connected truss bridge that was put in place in 1914 and 1915 to replace the original curved wooden trestle that bridged the creek. The many links and pins were salvaged from 2 through truss bridges that bridged the Bow River just to the east of a lift yard in Calgary. To these many links, new girder bridges, rocker bents, and internal framing were added. This stunning bridge, while difficult to photograph, is still readily accessible through the bike trail network that replaced the boundary subdivision. The model is scaled down 30% in length and height from the prototype dimensions, and similar to its prototype, it's the most structurally complicated bridge on the layout. Construction of the model began by soldering together telescopic brass tubing similar to the way the other bridges were built. 4 lengths of inverted brass channel were then soldered to the central frame, and the whole assembly was cross-drilled with a number 69 drill on a knee mill at very precise center-to-center distances in order to assure that the links that would eventually hang from these holes would not be flexed in the final assembly. The more than 250 links on the model, as well as the laced vertical pillars, were etched from 10 thou brass stock. The gusseted framing used to hold those pillars in alignment were laser cut from resin-impregnated laser board, and the final details, including the rocker bents and girder panels, were constructed in a similar way to the other bridges, using microengineering and Central Valley components. The assembly of all those links and pins and components was certainly time-consuming and complicated, but I think the end result was worth it, and the final bridge model bears a pretty good resemblance to the original prototype. Continuing on about a half a mile to milepost 41.7, the rails then cross Bar Creek, or Bear Creek. Interestingly, the bridge here is nearly identical in size and construction as the McCormick Creek Bridge. It's 410 feet long and 190 feet high, and similar to the McCormick Creek Bridge, it comprises 3 85-foot-long deck truss bridges sandwiched by 2 80-foot-long deck plate girder bridges. The model is compressed 30% in length and height from the prototype, and was built at the same time and using the same techniques as the McCormick Creek Bridge. The only difference is this is a straight bridge, whereas the McCormick Creek Bridge is on a sharp curve. Soon after Bar Creek, the rails veer away from the Arrow Lakes watershed and begin their slow, steady climb up Pup Creek to the crossing of the Monashee Mountains at Farron Summit. Once past Farron, the rails follow McCrae Creek through McCrae Canyon and down into the Kettle River watershed. The geology in McCrae Canyon was treacherous, and the line was subject to numerous rock and snowslides during its use. These slide paths required the Canadian Pacific to not only put in 2 very large wooden snowsheds, but also to bridge one of the paths with a through truss bridge at milepost 69.3. The Columbia and Westerns Bridge at this location is a 150-foot long through truss bridge from BLMA, which is a pretty close match for what the prototype used. After falling for 25 miles from the summit at Farron, we reach one of the visual highlights of the Boundary Subdivision, 81 miles from the division point of Nelson, the 5th crossing of the Kettle River. The bridge comprises 7 spans and is 505 foot long and stands 80 foot high above the water. It's comprised east to west of one 45 foot long deck girder bridge, one 85 foot long deck girder bridge, 2 central 150 foot long deck truss bridges, and one 75 foot long deck girder bridge. The original crossing here was actually a very large wooden structure with 2 huge approach trestles which were later filled in with rock. It was the intention from the beginning that a model of this impressive bridge would be one of the visual highlights of the layout, and the model is 100% to scale in height and length, although only one of the approach fills is modeled. The model, just as with the prototype, bears a very strong family resemblance to both the McCormick Creek and the Bar Creek bridges, and its construction is similar as well. There's a central brass frame, to which are attached components from Plastruct, Central Valley, and Microengineering. The piers are made from Central Valley components, and the cut stone foundations upon which they sit are Chooch Enterprises resin castings. And finally, the abutments at both ends are carved from balsa wood covered in epoxy wood filler before painting. And with the 5th crossing of the Kettle behind us, that brings us to the end of the model portion of the Boundary Subdivision. I hope this video has given you some insights into both the prototype and the modeling that the Columbia and Western is based on, and I hope you've seen some of the reasons why I've developed such a significant appreciation for the bridges of the Boundary.